When the pilots passed out mid-flight, a 12-year-old boy took the controls. His actions brought tears to everyone's eyes. When 12-year-old Ethan Parker walked into the bustling airport terminal, the sun had just started painting the horizon. His wide eyes sparkled with excitement, his trusty aviation manual tucked tightly under his arm. Adorning his small backpack were vibrant airplane stickers, each representing a dream of soaring through the skies. Beside him, his mother, Emily, carried a modest suitcase and a warm smile that reflected her pride. This trip wasn't just a vacation. It was the result of long months of saving and planning, a gift for her aviation-obsessed son. As they reached the boarding gate, Ethan was unstoppable, pointing to the planes on the tarmac with remarkable precision. "Look, Mom, that's a Boeing 737, and over there, an Airbus A320. Emily chuckled. "You know your planes, don't you? One day you'll be in that cockpit, Ethan." The moment they boarded the plane, Ethan's excitement reached a new high. He couldn't resist sneaking a glance at the cockpit as they passed by, imagining himself in the pilot's seat. Settling into his window seat, he eagerly observed the flurry of activity outside, the mechanics, the luggage carts, and the majestic planes preparing for flight. "Did you know this plane can fly at 560 miles per hour?" Ethan exclaimed, his voice buzzing with enthusiasm. Emily, fastening her seatbelt, smiled indulgently. "That's incredible, Ethan. Maybe someday you'll be the one telling passengers all about it." As the plane roared down the runway, Ethan's heart raced. The sheer power of takeoff filled him with a sense of wonder. The world below blurred into a patchwork of clouds and tiny landscapes, and for Ethan, this was pure magic. Once in the air, Ethan's curiosity remained insatiable. He peppered the flight attendant with questions about altitude, speed, and flight procedures, impressing her with his knowledge. "I even know how autopilot works," he said shyly but proudly. She smiled warmly, handing him a small sticker with the airline's logo. "You're already a little expert. Keep it up, and maybe one day we'll work together." Ethan beamed, tucking the sticker into his backpack like a treasure. For him, this wasn't just a flight. It was a step closer to his dream. But dreams have a way of testing us in ways we least expect. High above the Caribbean Sea, the serene flight was interrupted by a faint jolt. It was subtle at first, a gentle shake that barely raised concern among the passengers. But Ethan noticed. His sharp eyes darted to the wing outside, which swayed slightly. "Mom," he whispered, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "That's turbulence, right?" Emily reached over, squeezing his hand gently. "It's normal, honey. The pilots know what they're doing." Ethan nodded, trying to reassure himself. Yet something felt off. Another jolt came, harder this time, followed by a strange metallic sound. The cabin grew eerily quiet, and unease began to ripple through the passengers. Ethan's stomach tightened as he fixed his gaze on the illuminated seatbelt sign above. The captain's voice crackled through the intercom, calm but brief. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some turbulence. Please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened." While others might have been reassured, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The plane jolted sharply again, and this time even Emily's calm demeanor faltered. Ethan's grip on the armrest tightened, and his knowledge of aviation made him painfully aware of what could go wrong. Panic began to take hold of the cabin as oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling. Emily quickly secured their masks, her eyes scanning the frightened faces around them. Ethan, though terrified, was already calculating what might be happening in the cockpit. "Mom," he said through the mask, his voice firm despite the fear, "I think the pilots need help." Little did Ethan know, he was about to face a moment that would test his courage, knowledge, and determination in ways he had never imagined. The cabin was a chaotic mix of gasps, murmurs, and muffled cries. Passengers clutched their armrests and each other as the plane jolted violently again, the noise of alarms cutting through the tension. Ethan could feel his heart pounding, but amidst the rising panic, he kept a sharp focus on the situation. The flight attendant, Lisa, struggled down the aisle, checking seatbelts and urging calm. Ethan stopped her as she passed by. "Ma'am," he said, trying to mask his nervousness, "what's happening in the cockpit? Have you checked on the pilots?" Lisa paused, caught off guard by his question. "The pilots are handling it, sweetheart," she said, her voice tight. Ethan shook his head. "No, something's wrong. I know they'd be giving more updates if everything was fine." Lisa hesitated, her eyes darting toward the cockpit door. Ethan's confidence in his observations surprised her, but she couldn't allow herself to panic. "Let me check," she said, more to calm him than out of belief in his concerns. Emily leaned closer to her son. "Ethan, this isn't your responsibility. Let the crew handle it," she said softly, though her hands trembled. But Ethan couldn't let it go. "Mom, if the pilots can't fly the plane, someone has to do something." Before she could respond, another violent lurch threw passengers forward, and shrill alarms blared louder. Lisa, barely maintaining her balance, reached the cockpit door and hesitated. Then, with trembling hands, she entered the emergency override code. The door slid open, and what she saw froze her in place. Both pilots were slumped over the controls, unconscious, their oxygen masks askew. The cockpit was bathed in the eerie glow of flashing red and yellow lights, warning of critical failures. The plane's controls jolted slightly under autopilot adjustments, but it was clear the system couldn't handle the escalating turbulence. "Oh my God," Lisa whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan, sensing her shock, unbuckled his seatbelt. "What's going on?" he asked, as he moved toward the cockpit despite Emily's protests. "Stay here, Ethan," Emily called, but he was already moving, his aviation manual clutched tightly in his hand. Lisa turned to him, her face pale. "The pilots, they're unconscious. I don't know what to do." Ethan's gaze fell on the lifeless pilots, and for a moment, fear gripped him. But then he looked at the control panel and recognized the instruments he had studied so many times in books and flight simulators. His hands trembled as he turned to Lisa. "I can help," he said firmly. "I know the basics. I've studied this. I've even flown simulators." Lisa blinked at him, trying to process his words. "You're just a kid." "There's no time to argue," Ethan interrupted, his voice rising. "If we don't stabilize the plane, it's going to crash." Emily had reached the cockpit by now, her face etched with fear. "Ethan, you can't! It's too dangerous!" He turned to her, his eyes filled with determination. "Mom, I have to try. If I don't, who will?" Lisa looked at the controls, and then back at Ethan. Desperation clouded her judgment, but his confidence gave her a glimmer of hope. "All right," she said, her voice trembling, "but I'll be right here with you." Ethan climbed into the co-pilot's seat, his heart pounding in his chest. The instruments blinked and beeped, each sound a reminder of the stakes. Gripping the yoke, he looked back at Lisa. "Can you help me contact air traffic control?" he asked. Lisa nodded, her fingers fumbling as she activated the radio. A crackling voice came through the static. "This is Miami Air Traffic Control. Identify yourself and state your situation." Ethan grabbed the radio, his voice shaky but resolute. "This is Ethan Parker. I'm a passenger. Both pilots are unconscious, and the plane is descending rapidly. I need help." There was a pause, and then the calm, professional voice returned. "Understood, Ethan. Stay calm. We're here to guide you. Can you tell us the current altitude and airspeed?" Ethan scanned the panel, locating the necessary instruments. "We're at 20,000 feet, but we're dropping fast. Airspeed is 350 knots. "Good job, Ethan. First, let's stabilize the descent. Gently pull back on the yoke, but not too much. Watch the artificial horizon and keep the wings level. Taking a deep breath, Ethan followed the instructions. The yoke felt heavier than he imagined, but he adjusted carefully, watching the instruments as the plane began to level out. The tension in the cockpit was palpable, but as the plane steadied, a flicker of relief spread through Ethan. Yet he knew this was only the beginning. "Ethan," the voice from Miami said, "you're doing great. Now we'll work on slowing the plane down. Are you ready?" "Yes," he replied, his voice steady. Emily stood behind him, her hands clasped tightly. She had never been more terrified in her life, but as she looked at her son, she saw something incredible, a bravery she hadn't known he possessed. Ethan's eyes stayed locked on the instruments, his hands firm on the controls. This was no longer a dream. It was a reality more daunting than he had ever imagined, and he was determined not to let anyone down. Ethan's hands gripped the yoke as the Miami air traffic controller's voice filled the cockpit again, calm and steady. "Ethan, let's reduce your airspeed. Locate the throttle levers on your right-hand side. Gently pull them back to reduce power, but do it gradually." Lisa pointed to the throttles, her hands trembling as she explained, "Here, Ethan. Be careful. Even a slight adjustment can make a big difference." Ethan nodded, his heart hammering in his chest. He placed his hand on the levers and pulled them back slightly, feeling the aircraft's engines respond. The vibrations in the cabin lessened, and the airspeed needle began to drop. "It's working," he said, relief evident in his voice. "Great job," the controller encouraged. "Keep the airspeed steady, but watch for turbulence. Next, check your altitude. You need to level out before we guide you toward the runway." Ethan glanced at the altimeter. "We're at 15,000 feet and holding steady," he replied. Lisa let out a shaky breath. "You're doing great, Ethan. You're keeping us in the air." Emily, standing behind them, couldn't take her eyes off her son. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice tight with emotion, "you're so brave. I'm so proud of you." But Ethan didn't respond. He was too focused, his eyes scanning the instruments. A new alarm suddenly blared, and his stomach dropped. Red lights flashed on the control panel. "Miami!" Ethan said into the radio, his voice tense. "There's another problem. It says, hydraulic system failure." The controller's voice paused for a moment before responding. "Okay, Ethan, that's serious, but we can work through it. The hydraulic system controls many parts of the aircraft, including the flaps and landing gear. Do you see a secondary hydraulic system switch on the panel?" Ethan scanned the controls. His aviation studies had prepared him for scenarios like this, but in the real world, the stakes were higher than he'd ever imagined. "I see it," he said. "Good. Activate the backup system. It won't restore everything, but it'll give you enough control to land safely." Ethan flipped the switch, and the flashing lights dimmed slightly. "The backup is on," he reported. "Excellent," the controller replied. "Now let's check the flaps. They'll help you slow down as we prepare for landing." Ethan moved to adjust the flap lever, but another warning light blinked on. "It says partial flap failure," he said. "That's manageable," the controller assured him. "We'll adjust your speed and angle during the approach. Ethan, you're doing an amazing job. We're almost there." Lisa placed a reassuring hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Keep going, Ethan. We believe in you." But as the plane stabilized, another problem emerged. Ethan noticed the fuel gauge dropping rapidly. "Miami, I think we're losing fuel," he said, his voice cracking for the first time. The controller's tone grew more urgent. "Ethan, that's critical. We'll need to expedite your descent. Let's set up a direct approach to the nearest runway. Look at your heading indicator and turn the plane to 240 degrees. Ethan adjusted the heading knob, his fingers slick with sweat. The plane began to bank gently to the left, aligning with the new course. Below, the clouds parted, revealing the glimmering lights of Miami International Airport in the distance. "You're on track, Ethan," the controller said. "Keep the plane steady. Once we're closer, we'll talk about landing." The tension in the cockpit was palpable. Emily clutched the back of Ethan's seat, her knuckles white. "Ethan, you can do this," she said softly. He glanced at her, his eyes wide but determined. "I have to, Mom. There's no other choice." The plane shook again as turbulence hit, causing Lisa to grab onto a nearby handle for support. Ethan tightened his grip on the controls, his muscles straining as he fought to keep the aircraft level. "Miami, we're experiencing turbulence," he reported. "Stay calm, Ethan," the voice replied. "You're doing great. The turbulence will ease as you descend further. Let's set up your approach speed. Reduce the throttle a little more, but not too much. Watch your airspeed." Ethan adjusted the throttle carefully, feeling the plane respond. The airspeed needle crept downward, moving into the safe range for landing. Behind him, passengers began to notice the steadiness of the flight. Murmurs of fear shifted to cautious hope. A young boy in row 12 leaned over to his mother. "Mom, are we going to be okay now?" "I think so," she replied, her voice tinged with tentative optimism. Back in the cockpit, Ethan took a deep breath. The lights of the runway grew larger, a beacon of safety in the darkness. But he knew the hardest part was yet to come. "Miami," he said into the radio, "we're almost there. What's next?" "Ethan, this is the final stretch," the controller said. "When we get closer, I'll guide you through the landing process. You're doing an incredible job. Just stay focused." Ethan nodded to himself, his determination unwavering. He glanced back at Lisa and Emily, then returned his gaze to the controls. "Let's finish this," he said under his breath. As the plane hurtled toward Miami International Airport, Ethan's focus sharpened. The cockpit was filled with a mix of tension and determination. The controller's voice crackled through the radio. "Ethan, the runway is in sight. I need you to lower the landing gear. There's a lever to your left. Pull it down gently." Ethan reached for the lever, but as he pulled it, a loud, grinding noise echoed through the cockpit. The gear warning light blinked ominously. "It's not deploying," he said, his voice rising in panic. Lisa leaned closer to inspect the controls. "Is there a backup system for this?" she asked, her fear barely contained. "Ethan," the controller said, his voice calm but urgent, "the landing gear might not deploy automatically due to the hydraulic failure. There's a manual override lever near your feet. Pull it toward you and hold it steady." Ethan quickly located the lever and yanked it toward him with all his strength. The grinding noise intensified, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then, a faint thud vibrated through the plane. "Check the indicators," the controller instructed. Ethan glanced at the panel. "The lights are green. The gear is down." Cheers erupted from the cabin as the flight attendant made the announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, the landing gear has been deployed. Please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened." Emily clasped her hands to her chest, tears streaming down her face. She whispered a silent prayer, her eyes never leaving her son. "Ethan, the hardest part is coming up," the controller continued. "The descent angle and speed are crucial. We'll guide you step by step." The plane descended further, the lights of the city sprawling out below like a glowing map. Ethan adjusted the flaps, battling the partial failure while keeping one hand steady on the yoke. "Ethan, your approach speed should be 150 knots, the controller said. "Check your airspeed and adjust as needed." He nodded, glancing at the speed indicator. The needle hovered slightly above the target. He gently pulled back on the throttle, bringing the speed into range. Lisa pointed toward the windshield. "There's the runway." The strip of lights grew larger, illuminating the path to safety. But as they drew closer, another warning alarm blared. "What now?" Ethan muttered, his nerves fraying. Lisa checked the panel and froze. "Wind shear warning," she said, her voice tight. The controller's voice turned even more urgent. Ethan, wind shear can cause sudden altitude changes. Keep a firm grip on the yoke. If the plane drops, gently pull back but don't overcorrect. The turbulence returned with a vengeance. The plane swayed violently, and passengers screamed as it tilted dangerously to one side. Ethan gritted his teeth, pulling the yoke back just enough to level the aircraft. "Steady," the controller said. "You're doing great. The runway is straight ahead. Keep your descent angle shallow. Too steep and you'll hit too hard." Ethan adjusted the yoke, his movements precise but hesitant. The ground rushed up to meet them and the runway lights filled the cockpit. "Reduce throttle to idle," the controller instructed. "Let the plane glide in. When you're about 20 feet above the ground, pull back on the yoke slightly to flare the aircraft." "Got it," Ethan replied, his voice steady despite the chaos. The aircraft approached the runway, its massive wheels ready to touch down. Ethan could feel every second stretching into an eternity. 20 feet, Lisa whispered, her eyes glued to the altimeter. "Pull back now," the controller said. Ethan pulled the yoke back gently, feeling the nose of the plane lift slightly. A moment later, the wheels hit the tarmac with a bone-jarring thud. The plane bounced once, then settled onto the runway, speeding down the strip. "Apply the brakes," the controller said. Ethan reached for the brake lever, pulling it carefully. The screech of tires echoed through the cabin as the plane slowed, its momentum finally easing. The aircraft came to a halt at the end of the runway. For a moment there was silence, then cheers and applause erupted from the passengers. Lisa hugged Ethan tightly, tears streaming down her face. "You did it!" she exclaimed. Emily rushed forward, wrapping her arms around her son. "I knew you could, Ethan, I knew it." The radio crackled once more. "Ethan, this is Miami Control. You've just performed a perfect emergency landing. You're a hero." Exhausted but relieved, Ethan slumped back in the seat. The weight of what he had just accomplished began to sink in. "Everyone's safe," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. The flight attendant entered the cockpit, her face alight with gratitude. "Ethan, you've saved all of us. Thank you." Ethan managed a small, tired smile. "Just glad we're on the ground." As the plane came to a full stop on the runway, the cabin filled with the sound of clapping and relieved cheers. Passengers unbuckled their seatbelts, many hugging each other in gratitude. Some were still shaking, but the overwhelming feeling of relief eclipsed the earlier terror. Ethan remained in the cockpit, his hands still gripping the yoke, staring at the illuminated controls. Lisa gently touched his shoulder. "Ethan, you can let go now. We're safe." He blinked, as though waking from a dream, and released the yoke. His fingers ached from gripping it so tightly, but he didn't care. He had done it. Outside, flashing lights of emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft. Fire trucks and ambulances lined the runway, ready for any potential injuries or fires. Paramedics rushed aboard, assisting passengers and calming those still visibly shaken. A uniformed pilot climbed into the cockpit to assess the situation. His eyes widened as he saw Ethan in the co-pilot's seat. "You're the one who landed this plane?" Ethan nodded hesitantly. "I just followed the instructions from air traffic control." The pilot shook his head in disbelief. "You saved over 100 lives. That's no small thing, kid." As they disembarked, Ethan was greeted by applause from the passengers. His cheeks flushed as strangers came up to thank him, tears in their eyes. One elderly man gripped his hand tightly. "Son, you've given us all a second chance. You're a blessing." Ethan managed to smile but felt overwhelmed. All he had wanted was to survive, yet here he was, being treated like a hero. Emily ran to him as soon as he stepped onto the tarmac, pulling him into a tight hug. "I'm so proud of you, Ethan. You're incredible." He buried his face in her shoulder, finally letting the tension drain from his body. "I didn't think I could do it," he admitted, his voice muffled. She pulled back, cupping his face. "But you did. You proved to yourself and everyone else what you're capable of." Lisa joined them, wiping tears from her eyes. "You kept your promise, Ethan." You saved us all." As they embraced, a group of reporters gathered near the barricades, cameras flashing. News of the emergency landing had spread quickly, and Ethan found himself thrust into the spotlight. One journalist called out, "Ethan! How did you manage to land the plane?" Before Ethan could respond, a familiar voice came through the crowd, "Because he's always been brilliant with things like this." Ethan turned to see a man approaching, his suit crisp and his stride confident. It was his estranged father, Lucas. Emily's face stiffened, and Ethan froze. "What are you doing here?" Ethan asked, his voice tinged with confusion and a hint of resentment. "I came as soon as I heard," Lucas replied. "Ethan, I know we've had our differences, but I always knew you had it in you to do something extraordinary. Today, you proved that to the whole world." Ethan looked away, unsure how to process his father's sudden appearance. The adrenaline of the emergency was giving way to exhaustion and emotional overwhelm. Lucas continued, "I want to make things right, son. Let's talk, when you're ready." Emily stepped forward, her voice firm. "Ethan's had a long day. He doesn't need this right now." Lucas raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. "I just wanted to say I'm proud of him." The tension was palpable, but Ethan found himself softening slightly. "Thanks," he said quietly. Though he didn't look at Lucas directly, the reporters pressed in closer, asking more questions. But airport security intervened, guiding Ethan and his family to a private area inside the terminal. By the next morning, the story of the boy pilot was all over the news. Interviews, headlines, and social media posts celebrated Ethan as a hero. Offers for scholarships, aviation training, and even a guest spot on a popular talk show poured in. But for Ethan, the most significant change was internal. He felt a newfound sense of confidence. If he could land a plane in an emergency, what else could he accomplish? As they sat in the hotel room provided by the airline, Emily watched her son closely. "You've changed, Ethan," she said, smiling. "In a good way." He nodded. "I feel different, like I can handle things I never thought I could." Lisa, sitting nearby, chimed in. "You didn't just land a plane, Ethan. You showed everyone, including yourself, what you're capable of. Don't forget that." Ethan looked at the two women who had supported him through the most harrowing experience of his life. "I won't," he promised. As he stared out the window, watching the planes take off and land, he felt a spark of inspiration. "Maybe I'll become a pilot someday," he said with a small smile. Emily laughed softly. "After yesterday, I think you're more than ready for it." The story of Ethan's courage would be told for years to come, not just as a tale of survival, but as a testament to the resilience and strength we all have within us, even when we don't realize it.